Hi, my name is Terence Jeyaretnam. I'm an associate professor with the Monash Business School Department of Accounting and Finance, and I've been asked to speak about the climate risk disclosure requirements that are in place now in Australia. I wanted to provide a little bit of background to this. My sort of experience has been for the past 2 decades in sustainability and climate change consulting, and for the past decade as a partner at Ernst& Young, leading sustainability and climate risk work. But I'm also a member of the Auditing and Assurance Standards Board, and we'll come back to the Auditing and Assurance Standards Board um, that that basically issues auditing standards in Australia. But to set the scene, I wanted to provide a little bit of an introduction around climate risk. So climate risk, essentially what that means and how it sounds, is what it means. It's risk from climate change to business. So there's two types of risk that climate risk deals with. One is called physical risk, which is probably the risk that you'd all be familiar with. The physical risk of a changing climate and its impact on your entity as a business, um, all through the supply chain, not just on your footprint, but if you need particular parts or particular supplies coming from other parts of the world, how would climate impacts potentially risk your operation? And the second risk is called transition risk, which is if the whole world moves towards a low carbon economy, do you have a transition risk that you need to be mindful of? Are there carbon intensive processes in your entity that may be subjected to a carbon price because of the shift to a low carbon economy? So they're the two types of risks. And climate risk, in 2015, the Financial Stability Board determined that climate risk could be a systemic risk to business and financial institutions globally, and therefore asked Michael Bloomberg, who was previously the mayor of New York, but also leads Bloomberg Financial Services, to set up a task force to look at climate risk. And that task force came up with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is effectively a voluntary mechanism for business to disclose these risks and potential financial impacts of these climate risks, physical and transition, to their shareholders. And that's been in place for a decade now. That's been going along well. So up to 88% of the top 100 ASX companies were reporting to the TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And there was then a move a couple of years ago where IFRS, which is the body globally that, other than for the US, sets accounting standards globally and issues them globally. IFRS set up a separate body as part of a Conference of Parties on Climate Change. IFRS set up a separate body called the International Sustainability Standards Board to issue sustainability standards. And around that time, the Australian government, along with other governments around the world, but the Australian government has been the first mover, started to look at, in particular, the Department of Treasury, started to look at how do we regulate the disclosure of climate change in Australia. And the reason for that being that Australia as a country is probably one of the most exposed physically from a physical climate risk point of view, and most exposed from a transition point of view because of the amount of fossil fuels that we rely on both locally and in export. So the Treasury started to look at how do we regulate it. Accounting standards are not regulation, they're just standards, and up until regulated, they're not required, they typically are voluntary. So there were two sort of trains of work happening. One was the ISSB looking at issuing standards, and then the Australian Treasury looking at regulating climate risk. Fast forward a year and a half, 2 years from there, the ISSB issued two standards. One is a general sustainable reporting standard, S1, and S2, a climate risk or climate reporting standard. And Treasury did a lot of consultation, and with quite a lot of industry support and community organizational support, essentially proposed an amendment to the Corporations Act that means that climate risk will need to be disclosed by certain cohorts of companies under Australian Securities and Investment Commission reporting requirements. And so those two things went ahead. Internationally, the ISSB issues standards. The local body that looks at that standard and issues it locally is called the Australian Accounting Standards Board, the AASB. And similarly, for auditing, the International Auditing Standards Board issues the standard, and the Australian Auditing Accounting Standards Board, which I sit on, issues the auditing standards. So both those bodies in Australia started to set up the infrastructure for sustainability reporting. So they recruited some board members that had sustainability experience, which is where I came in. AASB did the same, but they also recruited team members to be able to assess these standards, consult on them, and issue them to the market. So what then followed is the issuance of the S1 and S2 in Australia. At the same time, the International Auditing Standards Board issued a particular sustainability assurance standard, which the AUASB looked at and issued locally. And the AUASB was asked by Treasury to also issue an assurance roadmap and requirements for assurance around the Corporations Act amendment. So there are four things that have been issued: the S1, S2, the assurance standard for sustainability reporting, and the assurance requirements for Corporations Act amendment on sustainability reporting or climate risk reporting. It's called sustainability reporting. It's confusing, but it's only climate risk. In terms of globally, there's movements in Brazil, Canada, UK, Europe as a collective. New Zealand has already climate risk reporting in place. The Europeans have much broader reporting requirements around sustainability more broadly. So there are different things emerging which are all trying to use the S1 and S2. So there's global sort of movement around this space. What's also worth sort of specifying is, well, what are the sort of types of companies that need to report under the Corporations Act? So by 24-25, which is starting 1 Jan. So for the calendar year report, it's starting 1 Jan 2026. And for the others, 30 June 2026 is the first lot of reports. So there's three groups of companies that are required to report under the Corporations Act amendment. Group 1 goes first. Group 1 has to trigger two of the three thresholds of 500 employees, one, consolidated assets of over a billion, and consolidated revenue of over 500 million. If you trigger two of those three things, you have to report, if you're a calendar year reporter, by the end of 31 December 2025, or if you're a financial year reporter, 30 June 2026. The year after, Group 2 needs to report, and Group 2 has to trigger two of the three criteria of 250 employees, consolidated assets of 500 million, so about half of the other thresholds, and consolidated revenue of 200 million. That's Group 2. And Group 3 reports a year later, 27-28. And Group 3 is 100 employees, consolidated total assets of 25 million or greater, and consolidated revenue of 50 million or greater. I think consolidated total assets is 250 million, not 25. So 250 million. Now, Group 3, according to the Treasury Amendment of the Corporations Act, which is now law, by the way, it was passed by both Houses of Parliament. Group 3 does not need to report unless it's found that climate risk is material to their business. And in order to find that climate risk is material to your business, you need to have done the homework. You need to go through the assessment, go through and look at climate risk impacts, and be able to show that it's not material to your business. And then you don't have to report. And you might have to refresh that every few years. But otherwise, if it's material, Group 3 has to report, and that's in the 27-28 year. So they're your three groups of companies. And then there's the assurance requirements, which flow on a year starting. There's a roadmap for assurance. They start with Scope 1 and 2 reporting, and that's greenhouse gas reporting requirements. But they flow on to other reporting requirements within S2. And in 4 years' time for Group 1, all of the requirements will require reasonable level assurance signed off by your financial auditor. So that's kind of the roadmap for assurance. And Group 2 starts a year later because they're reporting a year later, and Group 3 onwards. They all need assurance, and they all need limited to reasonable assurance, moving from limited assurance to reasonable level assurance. Limited assurance is the lower level of assurance, and reasonable assurance the highest order of assurance, which is the same level of assurance used for financial statement assurance. And the final thing to say is that the Australian Securities and Investment Commission is also consulting on how they're going to regulate this whole space on sustainability disclosure, i.e. if companies misinform their shareholders or do not present the actual, or they don't find the climate risk material when it is material, for example, ASIC needs to regulate the market, and ASIC regulates the market from a financial disclosure point of view, and ASIC is now setting up a sustainability reporting infrastructure within their team in order to regulate the market. And what they've said is for the first 3 years, they're not going to be they're going to be pragmatic about the way in which they look at disclosure, because it's a learning curve, it's a journey. But after that, they're going to start to regulate, and they're consulting on some of the guidance notes that they're going to put out and some of the regulatory mechanisms that they're going to put in place. So that's really, I guess, the big change to climate risk reporting, regulated climate risk reporting in the market, followed by assurance, followed by regulation of that, by policing of that by ASIC. So that's the change. That change, I guess, will start to happen by the end of this year. Obviously, if you're a calendar year report for 2025, you need to be working on climate risk data now in order to be able to report it by the end of this year. So work is already underway for Group 1 companies, and soon Group 2 will start. So there's quite a bit of work in the market, and hopefully this short piece around climate risk assists you in the way you consider climate and sustainability reporting and what that means in your course. Great. Thank you. Bye.